to PRI's next round All-Star election preview. So for our All-Stars gathered today, we have Lance Izumi, Senior Director of Education, Kerry Jackson, PRI Fellow for all issues related to California, Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications, and Rowena Itchon, myself, Senior Vice President. Thanks to our dedicated listeners as we once venture out to the punditry world. So guys, let's start with a general question. Let's face it, the statewide races aren't really drawing a lot of attention in California, but there are actually some interesting races for some of the constitutional offices and legislative races. So what race in California do you think should be drawing more voters and media attention, and why do you think so? So I'll start first. You know, I have an interest, I think all of us do, in Lance Izumi, who is running for controller, because like us, he's a free market wonk. Lanny was a Hoover Institution Senior Fellow for many years before he ran for office. And election watchers say that among the Republicans for statewide office, he's got the best chance. So if Chen wins, he will be the first statewide Republican elected official in over a decade, if you can believe that. Yeah, it's been a 10-year drought for the GOP. But get this, even the LA Times editorial board actually endorsed Lance Izumi, writing that he, quote, demonstrates a clear understanding of the possibilities and limitations of the controller. And he vowed not to use it as a perch to push a partisan agenda. Partisanship is the last thing we need here in California because, frankly, we are a one-party state. It's all we have. And I think this absolutely has everything to do with the lack of accountability in the state, where we've had fiascos like what happened in the Employment Development Department. Who could even begin to forget the tens of millions of taxpayer dollars that went straight to the hands of criminals, not to mention the tens of millions of more dollars of COVID relief that also went to a lot of shady characters. So we really need to clean up the state. So I'm watching this race pretty closely.
I'm looking at California State Senate District 6, which is a suburb of on the eastern side of Sacramento. The voter registration there is essentially perfectly even between Democrats and Republicans, both around 37, 36%, I believe. And then you have two candidates in the primaries, Roger Niello, who was a Republican, and Paula Viescas, a Democrat, who were almost identical in the amount of votes or the percentage of votes they got in the primary. So it's very close there. I think it's interesting. I'm not going to predict it's a bellwether. That if Niello wins, it's going to be certainly a red wave. And California's going to be it might be a trickle, no wave, of course, because you said, Row, that it's a single party state, and pulling away from that or moving away from that is going to take some time. Not going to happen in one election, two or three, I wouldn't think. But I also just find this interesting how close this is, where this is located, just outside of Sacramento. And the other thing is, and you mentioned about the endorsements from editorial boards. Well, Niello, a Republican, has the endorsement of the Sacramento Bee editorial board. I find that fascinating. It's just one race I wanted to keep my eye on, and I think is something to be interested in.
Well, I think that's a really interesting race, Kerry. And, for me, though, I'm looking at a couple of congressional races. And, the first race is up here in Northern California, and it's a race in suburban Sacramento area where Kevin Kiley, the state assemblyman and former gubernatorial candidate, is running for a congressional seat. And, it looks favorable for him given the registration numbers in that district. But, no Republican can ever take a seat for granted. If he wins this race and goes to Congress, I think that he is going to make a huge splash in Washington because, he's one of the brightest people, I think, in California politics right now. And he's also been one of the most courageous. He's been the person really, along with Assemblyman Gallagher, who have really been fighting Governor Newsom tooth and nail when, most other folks in the Republican Party seem to have been silent. And so I think that, it'll be really interesting to see, how he does in Congress. But I think he'll become a real leader there very fast. And also, too, I think he will become a bigger voice here in California as a U.S. congressman. And, he will be, I believe, one of the rising stars within the Republican Party in California. And I would also say that, Kevin Kiley has spoken at many PRI events on education because he had been not only vice chair of the Assembly Education Committee, but he had been a teacher at Manual Arts High School down in Los Angeles, pretty difficult high school down there in LA Unified. And so he has this education experience that most Republican legislators do not have. And so he's been an incredible voice on issues involving school choice, parental empowerment, transparency in education. So I think that he will bring a lot of policy chops to his new job as a U.S. congressman if he happens to win in November. I think the other race that I'm looking at is down in Orange County, kind of in your neck of the woods, Kerry, where Scott Baugh, the former state legislator, is running, Republican state legislator is running against the Democratic incumbent, Katie Porter, in the Irvine area. And I'm interested in this race because it kind of is a microcosm of how the two national parties are viewing the election. Katie Porter has basically put all her eggs in the abortion basket and is running commercials down in Southern California on that issue and making it her marquee issue as she runs for re-election, whereas Scott Baugh is hitting on issues involving the economy, inflation, those sorts of things. And so it'd be interesting to see how this plays out, in the general election. If there is a Republican wave across the country based upon worries about the economy and inflation, gas prices, food prices, those sorts of things, is it big enough win behind the sails of the Republicans to end up pushing somebody like Scott Baugh over the finish line and beating Katie Porter? We'll see about that come election day. Tim, what do you think?
So I actually have three races that people aren't really following but should be. So, in our statewide races, there are three incumbents who've had scandal-plagued first terms in office, really, to put it charitably. So, but surprisingly, all are on the path to landslide wins despite their alleged malfeasance and wrongdoing in office. So first you had Insurance Commissioner Ricardo Lara, who's been accused of taking tens of thousands of dollars from the insurance industry and then doing their bidding and taking official actions that benefited them. He charged taxpayers to rent an apartment in Sacramento. And then there was his fancy trip to London with an insurance industry lobbyist and questions over who paid for the trip. But yet, even though he does have a Republican opponent, there's hardly a campaign at all. You have State Treasurer Fiona Ma, who was accused of accepting, quote, improper gifts from businessmen in a lawsuit filed against her. She's had a history of sharing hotel rooms with staff, and she's been sued for sexual harassment by a female employee. Again, you would think there'd be a major opposition campaign, but there, and that she'd really be on political thin ice. But there's hardly been a campaign run against her either. And then, as Lance, I'm sure we'll discuss in more detail later, you have the superintendent of public instruction, Tony Thurmond, who's been a walking ethics disaster. He's been alleged by former aides to have created a toxic workplace in his office, and he's made a number of questionable decisions. But now, while he has a credible opponent in his reelection campaign, his opponent hasn't been able to raise sufficient sums to really seriously contest the election. And there's been not much media attention focused on the race. So here you have three what should be surefire wins for the Republicans. They're likely going to be landslide wins for these scandal-plagued incumbents. And I think that says really a lot about the sorry state of the GOP in California.
Well, speaking of ethics scandals, so Kerry, the hottest race in California this year is not the campaign for governor or U.S. Senate, but the race out here in Los Angeles for mayor. things were turned upside down in the campaign recently with the release of these tapes showing racist comments by 3 of the council members. Political observers have been pretty divided over whether this scandal plays to the strengths of Congresswoman Karen Bass or outsider Rick Caruso. So which candidate, if any, do you think has been strengthened after the scandal? And where do things stand as we tape this podcast about a week before the election?
I'm going to base my answer on the first question there simply on the polls. And I'm not going to pretend to have any political calculations going through my mind as to why I think this. But I'm going to say Caruso has benefited most because the most recent poll has him now up by 3 percentage points, 40 to 37. And this is a big change. At one time, Bass, I believe, had double-digit lead in the polls not that long ago. And maybe it's not so much voters warming up to Caruso as it is voters cooling to Bass, Karen Bass. As you said, you talked about some scandals. She's been involved in a little bit of scandal herself. She has been charged, or it's been alleged that she accepted a scholarship at University of Southern California in exchange for legislation being passed on a quid pro quo situation. And then there was also, I think there's something I find, I see it one way, I guess a lot of people see it the other way, but back in the summer months, her home was burglarized and some firearms were stolen. And this is somebody who's, you're not going to say is a hardcore Second Amendment supporter. And then you find out that this person has firearms, and they weren't even, she didn't even do a good enough job to keep them from being stolen. I mean, it's one thing for somebody to get in the house and get guns that are just laying around or maybe in a drawer or something. But if you have firearms, especially if you live in a metropolitan area, you need to keep those locked up. They need to be safe. They need to be in a gun safe that is not easy to get into. It deters just any kind of criminal. So I think there's probably been some cooling there that people who would otherwise vote for and approve of her stand in the Second Amendment, like say, I may not even vote for. And so then of course Caruso is gonna pick up those votes. So I think, as I say, I'm just going to go with Caruso at this point, benefiting the most. He's really picked up some tailwind here, it looks like, and what we're just getting real down to the end of the races. So yeah, I think he's benefited the most of what's been going on.
So Lance, there are several important school board races in California. There's been an interesting phenomena in California and across the country this election. Hundreds of parents frustrated with politicized classrooms are running for school board. So tell us about some of these races you're following and whether you think this is a real parent revolution and whether it will be successful.
Well, first of all, yes, I do think that this is the year of the parent. I think that, and it's because of that, it's not going to just have an effect on some local school board races, but I think it could have an effect on a much wider scale, perhaps even statewide as well. You look at the state superintendent of public instruction race that Tim referred to a little bit earlier. I mean, yes, you do have a Democratic incumbent, although he's not listed, they're not listed by parties, but the incumbent is Democrat Tony Thurmond. And, he's a person who, had been in the legislature for many years, had actually served on a school board previously, and then the CTA backed him, the California Teachers Association backed him to become the state superintendent of public instruction. So he's got all of this institutional special interest support behind him, and he should have won this race going away. But, in the primary, what you saw was he was held to well under 50%. And he had 3 main opponents, all of whom were unknown, basically, and had virtually no money. And yet Tony Thurmond could not crack the 50% mark against those 3 candidates. And so I think what that shows you is that there is real discontent, not just with Tony Thurmond, because, let's say, of the hostile work environment that Tim mentioned earlier, but also perhaps scandals involving giving jobs within the California Department of Education to cronies who are out of state when in-state Californians could do the job just as well. But more than that, I think there's just a dissatisfaction amongst parents and the public in general, but especially parents with the way California has handled education, especially over the COVID crisis. They didn't like the fact that the schools were locked down and closed for as long as they were. Tony Thurmond offered no real leadership during that time to try and open the schools sooner and to meet the demands of parents. I think the issues involving masks and vaccination also annoyed parents a great deal. And again, no leadership from the state superintendent's office. So I think that dissatisfaction with Thurmond showed itself in the primary, where he was held well below 50%. And when you look at his opponent now for the general election, Lance Christensen, who has a family with children, who speaks on behalf of those kids and those parents who haven't had a voice in this, in basically the last 2 or 3 years over the pandemic, and where it's all been top-down edicts from Sacramento. I think that kind of dissatisfaction is going to translate into a lot of votes, even for somebody who is relatively unknown like Lance Christensen, because when you look at what happened in places like San Francisco, where the school board was recalled because of the ultra progressive policies that were being pushed by the board that were not only against the wishes of parents, but also didn't address the real issues in the San Francisco school district involving academics and the issues involving the pandemic. I think that type of dissatisfaction is statewide, and it could end up causing a surprise in the superintendent's race, where somebody who is much, much less known, does actually benefit from this anti-incumbent frustration with education in California. I think maybe the finishing touch of this is the fact that Tony Thurmond has delayed the release of the state test scores. He's been pressured to finally say that he'll release them before the election. But, again, that type of move just smacks of just insider type of protection for the incumbent. And I just think that that's not going to play well. I think on the local level, I'm looking at a number of different school board races. As you mentioned, Rowena, there are a lot of parents who are frustrated, and a lot of them have ended up running for school board. And there are literally hundreds of parents across California who have decided to take out papers and run for school board. And I'm looking at 2 particular races just as an example. One up here in Northern California for Jean Pagnoni, who is running with a slate of parents in a small elementary school district outside of Sacramento. But I think that is kind of emblematic of the type of thing that you're seeing across California, where you have slates of parents who have decided to run in different school districts for those boards. And I'm looking also at down in Orange County, a woman named Kira Davis, who is running for the board in Capistrano Unified School District. PRI had actually done a film based on the Capistrano Unified School District a number of years ago on the need for choice for the middle class. And I think she's running on issues involving accountability, transparency, and changes in curriculum, especially against a lot of the woke type of curriculum that is going into schools. And so I'm looking at how she's going to do in her race, because I think those types of races are going to indicate how much the parent revolution is really is succeeding here in California.
Well, our listeners might be surprised to hear that California is actually a battleground state for control of the House. There are 10 hot congressional races. Tim, you've been following them, and they're actually being seriously contested by both parties, with lots of millions of dollars spent. So what are some of the more interesting races that are being waged across the state, and do Democrats or Republicans have more of an edge?
Well, when I think when the campaign began, the Democrats were feeling bullish about their ability to gain seats in California, especially because redistricting made a lot of the seats, especially for some of the Republican freshmen who were elected in the last election, more friendly to Democrats. But, as the campaign has evolved, it's Democrats who've been pushed back on their heels. And as we sit here a couple of weeks out from the election, it's growing increasingly likely that none of these Republican incumbents are going to lose, and the GOP may even gain a seat or two. Part of it's due to money. The national Republicans have fundraised a lot better than the national Democrats, and their super PACs are significantly outspending the Democrats in the California races and in the other states. And so now you're seeing Democrats having to kind of triage and make decisions on their campaign spending based on boosting incumbents rather than going on offense. So you saw, for example, Democrats really cancel ad spending in Los Angeles that was meant to benefit former Assemblywoman Christy Smith, who's challenging Congressman Mike Garcia. But typically you take that as a sign that they're throwing in the towel in a race that really on paper they should be favored to win. And you're seeing Republicans on the offense. They just bought another $2 million in ads to go against Congresswoman Katie Porter in Orange County and Congressman Mike Levin in San Diego. So to me, the whole story of the race for Congress in California is typified by this open 13th district that it encompasses the Central Valley. It's a new seat that was created during redistricting. On paper, it's a lean Democrat seat. But as you know, Democrats in the Central Valley are more conservative. They're more open to crossing party lines. Now, the Democratic candidate is Assemblyman Adam Gray, who's the head of the moderate Democrats in Sacramento, and he's been a prodigious fundraiser. And you'd think he'd be the fundraiser in this race. Now, Republicans, they recruited John Duarte, who's a farmer, to run against Gray, and they've been fully backing him with millions of dollars in outside spending targeting Gray as a tool of special interests. And earlier this week, you saw this race has been moved by national prognosticators to a toss-up race. So, that race might actually be won by the Republicans. I think that's a real sign of how things are going in California. And you saw even seats that they had on their radar as potential target opportunities, like the Kevin Kiley race that Lance mentioned earlier, or Will Rollins, who's running against Congressman Ken Calvert. They haven't materialized as serious pickup opportunities. So I think the California races, which Democrats really were counting on to help them try and hang on and keep their House majority, they really typify the real challenge they're having across the country in campaign 2022. So, Ro, the highest profile statewide races in California this year are not really for the statewide offices, but they're actually for the ballot measures. And we're seeing several big and expensive campaigns being waged on things like gambling and vaping and even dialysis clinics. So what are some of the key statewide measures that you're following this year?
Well, frankly, Tim, I am tired of them all because they are all over the airwaves here in Southern California. So as you mentioned, the two propositions that have taken up a lot of the ad space are the two gaming propositions. So Prop 27 would allow online sports betting across the state, and Prop 26 would allow in-person sports betting only in tribal casinos and horse race tracks. So naturally, the tribal casinos have an interest in stopping statewide online sports betting and want to restrict betting to their own properties. So, if I were a betting gal, pun very much intended, it looks like the odds will be that they are both going to go down in defeat. So much for the $400 million spent on these campaign ads. There's also another proposition, Prop 29, which is very expensive. Again, voters know this proposition. It imposes new rules on dialysis clinics. Now, voters have got to be tired of this. It keeps coming back like a bad penny. I wrote about this, the last two initiatives, but thankfully our colleague, Mackenzie Richards, took up the mantle this time around. So the unions for years have wanted to unionize dialysis workers. And so far, these workers have actually resisted. Most Californians are probably baffled why they are even voting on these issues. Again, they're likely to vote it down. But the key issue here is money. Union forces want to force dialysis companies to spend money defending themselves with the hope that someday they will throw in the towel. So this is got to be one of the more sordid abuses of the state's initiative process. And I don't know if it'll come back. It probably will again in a few more years. So another issue that PRI has been following is Prop 30, which would impose a 1.75% personal income tax on the top earning Californians. Those are for incomes well over $2 million. Now, it's expected to raise about $5 billion annually. And the goal here is to help the state's pie in the sky, Alice in Wonderland greenhouse gas emission targets. So the end result, as we all know, is simply giving the state's most productive residents another reason to hightail over to Texas and Florida. So let's move on to the national scene here. There are scores of interesting races for governor and Congress that are drawing a lot of attention. So guys, what race outside California has attracted your interest, and why do you think Californians should be paying attention to these outcomes? I can start first. I'm interested in the Michigan gubernatorial race. Incumbent Democrat Gretchen Whitmer, she's got a national profile, and GOP candidate Tudor Dixon, who is her challenger. Now, I'm interested in this race because both are women, and I thought it's a kind of a test to see how the Supreme Court's decision on Roe would affect these races. Whitmer had a pretty substantial lead in September, but it's tightened in October. Inflation and Michigan's struggling economy seems to have kind of percolated up towards more of an immediate concern than abortion rights. So I'm watching this race. I think Whitmer will probably pull it off in the end, but by what margin? So I think it's going to be a closer race than people think. What about you, Kerry?
I think it's probably expected that I'm going to mention the Georgia Senate race between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. Being a Georgia native and Herschel being the football hero, at least for a good bit of Georgia, including myself. I maybe Georgia Tech fans don't think so highly of him, but after 40 years, maybe they do. That would be interesting. They both have some issues, and I think it's going to get ugly in the last days, right up until everybody's going to be at the ballot. Both of them have to deal with some domestic abuse allegations, and they're both going to be slinging that at each other. Warnock is, of course, trying to paint Herschel as a Trump man, which he essentially is. I don't know if anybody remembers that Herschel's last year at the University of Georgia, he couldn't play because he signed a contract, which he tore up, but it was too late. He signed a contract to play with the New Jersey Generals that were owned in the USFL, which were owned by Donald Trump. So they've been friends for 40 years. So as policy-wise, he is very, very close to Trump. And then Walker's saying, well, Raphael, you have voted with Joe Biden 86% of the time. How do you defend that? And so this is going to be a lot of back and forth. Herschel helped himself in the most recent debate, or the debate of about a week to 10 days ago is my memory. And I think he surprised a lot of people. So right now the latest poll has Warnock up by only 2 percentage points, which is certainly within the margin of error in a political race. And I don't know how much of the Atlanta or the Georgia media has gotten to this yet, but the Washington Free Beacon, I believe, was the first to come out and talk about the church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King Jr.'s church, where he was the senior pastor, or a pastor. I believe it was senior pastor. I could be checked on that before he became senator. Has been evicting people who lived on this property for really petty amounts of back rent, and Herschel is offered to pay for some of these people to keep their houses, and then Warnock is denying this has happened. So again, this is going to be back and forth all through until everybody goes to the polls. But I look at this one. I look at the Pennsylvania race between Dr. Oz and John Fetterman. I look at the race in Ohio. That's so very close to the Senate there, and all three of these are going to have an effect on where or how it's going to turn out in the Senate, who's going to get the majority, who's going to be able to control that chamber in 2023 and beyond. But that's the one I'm looking at the most. And again, yes, I admit, because being a Georgia or a Georgia boy, that's your eyes tend to look back to where you came from and wonder what's going on there. So that's the one I'm looking at the hardest.
Well, what I'm looking at is actually not a particular race, but a series of races, because I think that what's interesting to me is this movement across the country that's been going on for several years now of Hispanics who are moving towards the Republican Party. I mean, we really saw this in 2020 when President Trump and his emphasis on border security resulted in flipping a number of counties in previously Democratic places on the southern Texas border, in places like the Rio Grande Valley. And this trend has continued, after 2020's election, and to the point now where the Republicans have a whole slew of very strong Hispanic candidates who are running for Congress. You have people like Ana Paulina Luna, who is a 33-year-old Air Force veteran, who is probably going to become the next member of Congress representing the 13th district in Florida. She's like the granddaughter of Mexican immigrants, and just part of 43 Republican Latina candidates are running for House seats this year. You have people like Yesley Vega, who's running in Virginia's 7th congressional district, which is a hugely contested district. Abigail Spanberger, who is the Democratic incumbent, is usually listed as one of the most vulnerable incumbents in the United States. And so the Republicans have Yesley Vega, who is a local county official from Prince William County, who is really giving Spanberger a real fight there. You have Casey Garcia in Texas's 28th congressional district. Garcia is a staff member for Senator Ted Cruz, and she's waging a very strong campaign. And even places like Oregon, you have a local mayor up there, Lori Chavez de Rema, who is running in Oregon's 5th district. And people don't realize that this Republican wind that is just presenting itself across the country is not just blowing in southern states, Midwestern states, but even places like Oregon, where the governor race looks like it will eventually go to the Republican Christine Drazan up there, but also too it'll have its effect on congressional seats as well. And there are a number of democratically held congressional seats in Oregon that may go Republican. And so that red wave across the country will actually hit the West Coast, probably in places like Oregon. So I think that, if you have a lot of these Hispanic Republican candidates, especially these Hispanic Republican women who win these races, I think it's going to have a huge effect, not just across the country, but also here in California as well, because of the large Hispanic population that California has. And I think that it just goes to show that you hear oftentimes Republicans saying that they were former Democrats, but the Democratic Party left them. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of Hispanic voters, that the Democratic Party no longer reflects their values. And you're seeing not only just more Republican candidates of Hispanic heritage who are running for office, but they're also winning. So I think that a person like Myra Flores, who won the special election in that Texas congressional district a few months ago, that she's probably not going to be an outlier or anomaly, that it is probably going to be something that is going to be more widespread across not just Texas, but across the country.
Well, I agree with Lance. The race that I'm fascinated by is that Oregon governor's race, where you have really a kind of a doctrinaire left-wing speaker, Tina Kotek, who's running against a Democrat turned independent, who's running a moderate campaign. And then you have the Republican, Christine Drazan, who has really impressed everyone across the country. Oregon suffers many of the same problems as California on crime and homelessness and quality of life. And their outgoing Democratic governor, Kate Brown, has been highly unpopular and seen as causing a lot of these problems. And Kotek is kind of running on a continuation of the status quo. And Drazan is really running as the candidate of change. And you even saw Phil Knight, who's this, of course, of Nike fame, which is one of the most woke corporations, break with the Democrats. And he's given millions of dollars to both Johnson and now Drazan. It just sent her $1 million. So The polls show that in this unusual three-way race, Oregon really is on the cusp of electing its first Republican governor in decades. And I think that the potential for Oregon, of all places, to elect a GOP governor should give right-thinking people, even in deep blue states like California, some hope.
So let's move into our lightning round of predictions. So here's the first one. Who's going to be elected mayor of Los Angeles? So I'm going to go out on a limb here, like Kerry, and say Rick Caruso. Just 2 weeks ago, it was accepted that Karen Bass had it in the bag, but there's been a sea change in the electorate the last week or so. Caruso's been silent most of the summer. He's really stepped up the ads the last few days and stepped up his visibility. So I think it's going to be a surprise, the big surprise of the midterms. Kerry, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going with Caruso too. I think he's enough of a political outsider, and then Bass has her negatives seem to be, I don't want to say piling up, but they're starting to stack up a little bit. So I see it going to him.
I also think that Caruso is going to win. I actually think he may win by a significant margin. I think that it'll be interesting to see how the vote totals break down. But I bet you that Caruso will end up winning a lot of the Hispanic vote, for example. I mean, his advertisements have been targeting Hispanic voters. I think that his emphasis of the immigrant roots of his family. I think that and the fact that he's focusing on the issues that I think matter a lot to the average Hispanic voter in not just California, but in Los Angeles, whether it's homelessness and crime and safety issues. I think that's going to really play with Hispanic voters. So I think that Caruso is going to win a significant victory.
Well, I'm going to be a contrarian, and I say Karen Bass is going to win, but by a much smaller margin than people were talking about this summer. I think the remnants of the Democratic machinery is just enough to get her across the finish line. Certainly for nothing that she's done in her campaign. Most political observers have said her campaign has not been the greatest, but I think there's enough there that will get her over the finish line.
So the second prediction. So which party is going to control the U.S. Senate, and how many seats will each party have come January? I'm going to go with the status quo, 50-50. It looks like inflation and other economic woes, not to mention the weakness at the top with President Biden, I think it's going to thwart the Democrats' hopes of gaining more seats in the Senate. How about you, Kerry?
The same. I thought I'd be the only one to punt on this one, and it looked like I'm being kind of weaselly. But yeah, I'm going with 50-50. The Republicans, they have 21 seats to defend. The Democrats only 14. So I see this is going to be just the same as it has been for the last 2 years. Well,
I'm going to be person on the other side of this fence then, because I actually see the Republicans doing very well. I think that the Republicans will not only keep the seats they're defending, but I also think they're going to pick up some seats that not just ones that we've heard about, like the Herschel Walker seat. I think that in the end that Walker may be able to cross that finish line. But I do think that when you look at races like Adam Laxalt in Nevada, and I think that you look at some seats now that seem to be in play that hadn't been in play even just a couple weeks ago, like the Connecticut seat, where Leora Levy, the Republican, is actually closing in on Blumenthal, the long-term Democratic incumbent. And you look at the seat up in Washington State with Tiffany Smiley, who is running against Patty Murray. I think that I think that we're going to have some surprises come election night and in the days after, where you're going to see the anti-incumbent frustration, anger at the current situation in the United States play out in some of these Senate races, so that you're going to get some surprise Republican victories. And I think you'll probably end up with probably 52 to 53 Republican seats.
Well, I'm growing more optimistic about Republican chances for victory in the Senate, I'm much more bearish than Lance at this point, particularly due to the poor quality of Republican candidates in some of these big Senate races. I mean, there's some really nutty candidates that have been put up by the GOP in these key races who really are unelectable except in a big Republican wave. Now, we may be starting to see the signs of that, but I'm not really ready to go there yet. So, and even though you do see the gap narrowing some of these states like Georgia and Pennsylvania, the GOP candidates are still behind. So I agree with Kerry and Roe. I'm at 50-50. I have the Republicans winning Nevada, North Carolina, Ohio, and Wisconsin, and I have the Democrats winning New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona.
Well, thanks very much. And thanks to our audience for listening. And we're going to go back and see who's right and who's wrong. So shall we do the McLaughlin salute?
Yes.
Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Bye.
Bye.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.